this should be inserted.
Oh.
Sorry.
It's okay.
It has this thing.
It's really friendly sounding. Bing, ling, ding.
Okay.
Okay, cool.
It should be just, straightforward. Yeah, you want
Cool. Okay.
So you think it's about 40 minutes?
I haven't timed it. Every time I've done it, I practiced it. It's been cut off like in the middle.
That's okay.
So it's probably going to be about 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay, but even if it's longer, we have time in this room because the earlier period was no good because we had a talk. We had another class coming in.
Oh,
and
okay.
by 4:50. Yeah, we should have been out. And that's
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't know, but I think we'll be okay.
Yeah.
I think it'll be okay engaging. I hope.
Yeah, good. I'm always more nervous than the speakers because I need to read this.
You don't need to be more nervous. You probably know more about this than I do.
Okay, I think we are ready. It's 4 o'clock or maybe a little bit over 4 o'clock. I'm really glad to welcome Julia Crain today as our speaker. And before Julia starts her talk, I would like to introduce her shortly. Julia Crain holds a Master in Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State University and a Bachelor of Public Affairs from Seattle University. Her studies concentrated on community economic development in post-industrial America. A native to Butte, Julia has melded her love of cities and urban areas with the practical aspect of planning within a city's unique circumstance. In the case of Butte, she has watched the landscape transform from its pre-remedial state to the reclaimed state ready of today, ripe for restoration. Julia serves as Butte Silver Bow Superfund data administrator, and her talk will discuss the impact of remediation on the Butte landscape and how Butte Silver Bow has developed a robust environmental planning approach that ensures long-term maintenance of reclaimed areas while allowing for coordination and collaboration among remedial and restoration partners. And Julia is actually also one of our most frequently seen collaborators. So the Native Plan Project and Butte Silver Bow is kind of connected with Julia and Eric, whom I also saw in the audience. Oh, hi, Eric. And of course, Tom Malloy. And I'm really glad to have her, and we hope to have in the future other speakers to come. And before Julia starts, I was asked to announce another talk that will be tomorrow by Jim O'Connor, tomorrow at 4 p.m. And he will be talking about the Great Missoula floods of the last ice age. So if anybody is interested, these public lecture series are really great to visit, and I really, yes?
Yeah, so Jim is a distinguished Sigma Xi speaker to be speaking next door. Also, we learned today that Jack Horner is the paleontologist of Summer Now, who's just retired, will talk 2 weeks from yesterday, if I have the day right, in the auditorium, because we expect a large crowd for that, at 4 o'clock. So encourage you to go to both those things. I think they'll be great talks.
Yeah, but today we have something in front of us. Julia, please welcome, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Robert mentioned, my name is Julia Crain, and I work at Butte Silver Bow in the planning department, and have for the past 3 years in that role worked with the Superfund program. I am by discipline an urban planner. I have what some would say is an unhealthy relationship or obsession with quite urban areas and cities and the way that things operate within those cities. And I think when I describe that, it's always born of the relationship I have to Butte. And I am a fourth generation resident of this city, and my family immigrated to here from Ireland quite a while ago. And so I've got deep roots, and I think that makes me very closely tied to the landscape that we're going to be discussing today. When I first moved back to Butte after graduate school in 2011, I was given a very complicated project to really conceive of all of the land that we have in Butte that has a number of different uses, whether it be recreational or remedial, or just simply an open space use, and transfer that property from its current land use at the time into an open space use, either for conservation purposes or for recreational uses. And I sort of cut my teeth there and learned quite a bit on understanding how land uses in our community work. That became, through its natural progression, really understanding all of the remediated lands that we have in our community. And I began working with a really amazing group of people. I have an incredible group of colleagues that I work with who I say always make me look good because they're the experts with what they do. And what we do together is we are responsible for this area you see highlighted in green here called the Butte Priority Soils Operable Unit. This is an area of our community. It is the dense urban area that you frequent and see every day. And what we do is we work on a program to monitor the soils in the operable unit. This area is approximately 5 acres of dense urban and industrial land uses. It consists of approximately 600 acres of reclaimed land that require a periodic evaluation. And we work on ensuring that the reclamation within this area remains protective of human health and the environment. From there, I really utilize data that we collect to assist with environmental planning at our county, to implement a maintenance program of reclaimed areas, but also to manage the digital data collection of remedy and restoration projects that occur within the area. And then utilize those same tools to develop a collaboration with partners within the community, which Robert had mentioned. So I'm going to go way back, and the reason we got to go way back is because Superfund in Butte started, which I think is very interesting, quite literally the year I was born. So you're looking at a lifetime or a generation of things happening in our community. And when I'm referring to that, I always have to sort of refer to what I've heard from my colleagues who have shared their information with me. And historically, there were areas of our Butte Priority Soils Operable Unit that were identified as sources of contamination. At the time, in the 80s, a sampling regime was developed by the EPA to look at these source areas and collect data to determine the presence of contaminants of concern on those sites. There were a number of areas that were non-residential in nature, so no one lived there. They were industrial lands, most typically, or not zoned because we didn't have zoning when mining occurred. And their characteristic was waste rock, milling wastes, smelter wastes, and contaminated soils. And then a plan was developed to go in and perform remediation. Right here on, I guess it would be your right, because I'm also not very good at knowing directions. You have the Butte Priority Soils Operable Unit. This area is depicted here with blue water sources. So we have the very large sources of water to the east, which are the Berkeley Pit and the Yankee Doodle Tailings Pond. But you see some of our stormwater infrastructure just buried within this bubble. And the 178 reclaimed sites, which are depicted in salmon. So I don't have a pointer, but Montana Tech is sort of... Oh, it is? Oh gosh, good. Okay.
The center thing.
Okay. So if you're looking at it, we're right here right now. This is the Montana Tech campus. This is the BA&P walking trail, just to orient you. At the time, approximately 600 acres of land was reclaimed. Removals of the most highly contaminated soils were done. Capping of lower concentrations were capped in place, and then the design of these sites integrated stormwater features to convey stormwater offsite. As you may know, Butte Silver Bow in Butte proper lies upland of Silver Bow Creek, and with the contamination on our hill and an 11% slope, there was a likelihood that soils would carry down to this creek. The reclamation that was put in place was meant to keep those sediments in place, utilizing caps and vegetation. So I want to show you guys just a couple of examples of historic reclamation in Butte. We have here the Colorado tailings. This area right here is on the banks of Silver Bow Creek. It's an area today called Lower Area 1. What is interesting about this is that this moonscape is something that is now our Silver Bow Creek corridor. And approximately 1 million cubic yards were removed from that area and were removed and consolidated with the Clark tailings just to the south of that site. And they were then capped with a 36-inch cap with an impermeable clay layer so that water that would fall from the sky would not permeate and touch those contaminants. And then they were then populated with the Copper Mountain Sports Complex, which is located just south of the Copper Mountain Recreation Area. This particular methodology is really something that I want to highlight today as we talk about Butte Silver Bow's role in maintaining protectiveness of our sites. Within our regime of cleanup, we also have beneficial uses that are occurring on our reclaimed areas. Do any of you guys use the trail system that is adjacent to campus ever during your day-to-day? So you're seeing sort of these beneficial uses that are being integrated into the cleanup in Butte. So you're very intimate with them, you just may not know that they exist already. The Alice Mine is up in Walkerville. I'm not sure if any of you have seen this. It's sort of a paramount landscape feature in the north of our city. When I was little, I grew up in Walkerville, and this is what I looked at every day. Approximately greater than 800,000 cubic yards were lopped off the top of this and dumped back into the pit to the east, and then were capped in place. Like the Copper Mountain Complex, this also has an institutional control of a trail system placed on top to allow neighborhood residents to access the site. There's great interpretive information up there about the cleanup and also the Summit Valley itself, which provides a little bit of context about mining in the city of Walkerville. We have another example here, which is a little bit more recent. This is Foreman Park. So what we have here is the Mountain Con Mine. I don't know if any of you have made it there on your walks on the BAMP trail. This is what it looked like when I left in 2000. It was unremediated. And when I came back, it was this awesome park. The park has been replaced with trail systems, slopes that are designed to sort of create amphitheater-like areas, native plants, pavilions, and lookouts with interpretive information. So this is all part of the program that we have here at Butte Silver Bow. But what we're doing is we're really observing the land. And you can see that a lot of activities happen beyond just walking. And there's really a robust program that we have here in maintaining these sites, because we do want to make sure that when you have 600 acres of land that happen to be in people's neighborhoods, it's really important that they not only are protective, but that they have a resiliency. And we not only try to maintain the resiliency of those sites, but we also try to allow for use, because it doesn't make much sense to be fenced off from much of the place where you live. So these are just a couple of examples we have here. So over the course of the 80s and the 90s, we have a lot of lessons that are learned. And those lessons are really the result of trial and error. Early reclamation that was happening in really rural areas with landscapes that didn't resemble Butte, because there were not homes and neighborhoods that were interplaying or intermixing with the mining infrastructure. If you think of Golden Sunlight Mine near Whitehall, you see an area where there is very little urban development or human impact. But when you come to Butte, it's a new context. And Butte was really involved in this or really set a new context because it had a water source that was running through it, and that water source was being impacted by the historic mining. And we were starting something new, and for the first time in a new context, and how do you really do it? And there was a period of really experimentation, as it has been, I guess, described to me. Until Butte had come into play, science had really been mostly in those rural areas. In the 80s, The abandoned mines program here in Montana was really going out and just sort of putting dirt down and throwing seed and hoping it would stick, and that was reclamation. They learned that that wasn't holding. And in the 90s, experts from all different fields were being brought into Butte to really look at the landscape and figure out how could we best do this reclamation work. Experts from MSU were brought in, specialists in the industry were brought in. They were carrying out their own analyses of the Butte Hill. And it was resulting in all of these findings. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is, really resonating, because as we move forward to a record of decision for the Butte Priority Soils Operable Unit, we realized that there were significant insufficiencies in the early reclamation. And how could we recalibrate a program based upon the need for really suitable species, really suitable soils for our hill, and developing a standard for how that reclamation would occur? And then how would we evaluate the effectiveness of those items in the long term? And what happened and what was born from that was a program that we use at Butte Silver Bow, which is called the Butte Reclamation Evaluation System. And the BREEZE, as I call it, it's really not a breeze, but it's the BREEZE, is a formalized assessment tool that we use to evaluate the stability, integrity, and the protectiveness of reclaimed areas in Butte. It's an institutional controls program to ensure that our programs work in the long term. It sets a performance standard for all of our reclaimed areas. It emphasizes the presence of live vegetation. It closely monitors whether or not soils are moving and eroding to make sure that those caps that are on those reclaimed areas, those reclaimed caps, have an integrity that is holding soil so that the contaminants underneath are not being unearthed. It developed a methodology for evaluating those areas and guidelines for doing corrective actions if a deficiency is found. And it developed a schedule that was replicable to evaluate sites against this standard over time. So in 2007, after the record of decision was signed, the program really began in earnest. And it began in earnest with objective evaluators being hired. Since that time, we have utilized both internal and external evaluators, and it has always produced results for us that have driven the work that we do. One of the things that we found out is that early on, there were these 178 sites, and people would just go out and evaluate them, and they'd tell us that we had some work to do. It became very clear that over time we began to bite off a little more than we can chew, and we were unable to get to all of the work in 1 year. And so in 2012, we recalibrated, and what we had done is, rather than looking at the Butte Priority Soils Operable Unit as this one unit with all of these reclaimed areas, we took the area and divided it into quadrants. One here, one here, one here, and one here. And what we did is we divided the quadrants and distributed 150 acres of reclaimed area per quadrant, which allowed us to set up a regime for returning to those sites and evaluating them. We have quite a variety. Quadrant 3 has 76 sites. They're all really tiny. Sometimes they're in backyards, sometimes they're in parking lots, sometimes they're, wedged in between two close homes that are really close together. Whereas quadrant 1 are these very large sites, and so we have 29 of those. When we hire our independent evaluators, sometimes it takes them 7 days to complete the evaluation. Sometimes it takes 2 to 3 weeks due to the amount of travel that they're doing. But what it has allowed us to do is begin to have a logic behind how we are evaluating the sites. And so the sites that were evaluated in quadrant 1 in 2012 would then we would return to evaluate them again in 2016. So I'm here today with one full cycle of the BREEZE having been performed under this particular logic. The process is pretty interesting. This is an example of the BREEZE field form as it was designed in its original conception in 2007. The form really contains a bunch of qualitative data about the site, where you start talking about the site, what day you were there, so you can kind of refer to the weather and the precipitation at the time, who did the evaluation, what is the slope and the aspect of the site. And then we begin to go into sort of these qualitative observations and converting them into quantitative numbers. So we're looking at the site's vegetation of live ground cover, undesirable or weedy species. If we see desirable species, we're monitoring what those are down here. If there are weeds, we're monitoring what those are here, because all of that counts for or against the integrity of the site's cap. We're looking at noxious weeds, plant litter. Are we seeing a good turnover in plant life, or are we seeing too much kind of sitting there that is going to cause erosion in the future? We're monitoring erosion, site edges, barren areas, exposed waste, anything that could indicate that the cap that is on a site might not have the integrity that it needs to have. All of this being said, we then look at this and we say, wow, it's really interesting. You have some really nice vegetation here in the foreground, but this is part of the same site over here, and there's literally nothing growing. And what we want to say is there's risk here that what is underneath that cap could potentially be, could be exposed, and you've got cars that have driven through. It's very clear. So you keep track of all of these circumstances, and we develop maps that we then submit to the EPA, and we say, we have a plan for how we're going to fix this. And this is an example of one of the maps that was developed in 2012. The interesting thing about this particular process is the evaluators hand draw these maps, or they used to hand draw these maps in the field, bring them back to our office, and we would spend 2 or 3 months hand digitizing them in GIS. I think one of the things that I realized through this process is that there is a pretty significant culture change that happened when I became heavily involved in the project. And I'm not going to lie, this was probably born of my frustration with a lot of paper and files and having to move actual physical files around when I knew the capacities of technology. And so what I did is I worked with my colleagues, and we worked with the agencies and PRPs to develop a sort of revised process for how we were going to do this, to rely on the advantages of technological efficiencies available at the time. And what we did is, rather than utilizing the old systems, we asked for a new database to store information. So we had an old system that was outdated. It was from the 90s. We converted it into a new system that will allow us to host the database on the cloud. It would become then accessible through through an iPad, and the field evaluators could be out in the field monitoring things and entering data, so that I didn't have to enter data when it came back in the paper format. We integrated Esri ArcGIS Online into the program to capture spatial data in real time. When the evaluators are out in the field and they're looking at something and there's maybe a pretty significant issue on a site that's not necessarily related to the cap, like there's a fence down or there's a significant outbreak of weeds, we can see that in real time, and we can contact staff at the county and go out and deal with that immediately rather than waiting a full calendar year. And then trying to integrate the advantages of this digital solution into how we provide access to data. And that's something that we're really striving toward right now. The work began in 2014. It was beta tested during the 2015 evaluation season and finalized in 2016. And right now we're doing some final changes before we are trying to make the information that we collect available. This is all managed by our GIS manager, the data administrator, and the data coordinator at Butte Silver Bow. So this is an example of what the form looks like. This is what you would see on your iPad. And it's really trying to guide the user through it. All of the information that we are collecting now is immediately prompted, so I don't have to spend 2 weeks preparing 68 files. It's all just there. And that's something that has been tremendously valuable to how we approach the process of evaluating these sites and the cap's integrity. And so this is just all of the different elements of things that we look at. We look for site edges. Is there deposition occurring? Is there a weed problem? Is the slope steep and are we maybe missing something there? Is the erosion being caused because of that? Are there gullies? Is there exposed waste, and do we need to make a removal? Where is it coming from? It allows us to ask all of these questions. So you see that there are all sorts of things that we're looking at. It also gives the evaluators an opportunity to provide us a little bit of information about what they're experiencing in the field, because we're not there, they're there. And on that particular day, they're doing sampling to make sure that if they are saying it's exposed waste, that they have some information in there about what it is. They're really providing us with a more elaborate portrait of what is going on with the site and how it's being handled right now. We developed this, which really allows us to meet our reporting requirements. And then we have our ArcGIS system. Each of the blue areas is a breeze area, and they notate the different elements that they see and show us where the problems are. This is much more accurate than someone hand drawing something in the field, because it's allowing us to get down to a very geolocated point of where things are occurring and really start compiling very accurate spatial data of the conditions that we have within the Butte Priority Soils Operable Unit on our reclaimed areas. So we develop a map and we submit this. One of the interesting things that I have found just through the process of now that we've gone back to that quad 1 again this year is we're seeing some trends emerge. This site itself, because it didn't do well in the last evaluation, were completely reclaimed, both it and the site across the street. You can see that the aerial photography is very old, but if you look at it on Google Earth, it's beautiful. And there's only one little area that's kind of struggling, and it's underneath pine trees. So that really the acidity from the pine trees is, I think, causing a little bit of stress for the plants. But otherwise, it's doing really well. We're capturing information on where our stormwater is flowing on all of the sites. One of the unique things that we can do with that is then utilize the notion that water is present and then target plantings in those areas so that we take advantage of flows. But the trend that is most interesting is that most of the sites on the hill that are south facing, that see sunlight all day, are the areas of the hill that we're really finding the most struggle, or that are struggling the most. And we are working really closely with plant scientists and experts in the field to figure out if there are amendments that we can make in how we approach the revegetation of these particular slopes to deal with vegetation and making sure that we can maintain that live cover so that we don't have erosion issues occur in the future. There are a couple barren areas that were identified here. The mine yard up at the Lexington is actually undergoing, it's being cleaned up right as we speak. So we will envision in the next 4 years of very likely seeing further improvement within the site and seeing much less trigger items being prompted by the evaluation. So all that being said, our trigger items and all of the deficiencies that may be identified on a site prompt corrective action. And corrective action plans are developed to determine the work that is necessary to correct issues that may compromise the integrity of a cap. We can plan for materials that we will need to correct vegetation issues, figure out how much soil we need, how much seed and fertilizer and mulch we need to get our work done, and also what kind of equipment we're going to be needing, which allows us to sort of understand what it's going to cost to maintain these sites now and into the future. And then we develop work plans for our crews to implement. The work in the field is monitored by an operations manager, and we have an inspector that goes to all of our different stormwater infrastructure weekly, but particularly after storms, to make sure that sediments haven't moved from sites. And then 3 operators and 2 laborers who conduct our work. They do a lot of different things. So primary focus for Butte Silver Bow is stormwater. Stormwater is what conveys sediments to Butte Silver Bow, or to Silver Bow Creek. So here's an example of one particular piece of infrastructure. This is Catch Basin 8 at the bottom of Excelsior Street. After every storm, it fills with sediment. Sediment just comes from the hill and it ends up there. Our crews go in and literally muck it out with a backhoe, and they put it into a dump truck and they haul it to drying beds where the water leaves, and then once it's dry, it's moved to the mine waste repository north of town. Our crews then get in and physically vacuum all of the remaining sediments out of those infrastructure pieces so that when the next storm hits, there's capacity to take on the sediments so that it can be cleaned again in the future. This is incredibly important work because this is what is maintaining the integrity of cleanup in our community. They prepare sites for fall seeding. In 2015, this particular area was recognized as lacking in vegetation cover, and so they go in and scarify the site. They bring in clean fill if necessary, and then they come back after October 15th and they put new seed down. And so they take care of seeding of the hill as well. So if there are barren areas or areas where vegetation improvements are required, our team takes care of that. These are from 2012 when we got our first hydro seeder, which has made the seeding process so much easier for Butte Silver Bow. We also have the institutional controls program, and this is an image of actually near one of Robert's planting areas, but residents of the Big Butte neighborhood were accessing the Butte Anaconda and Pacific Trail or the BNP Trail from their neighborhood, and they were crossing reclaimed areas. And when you have people walking on vegetation, the vegetation dies, and we know that the vegetation is keeping the integrity of that cap in place. Rather than minimizing or eliminating public access to the site, our crews worked proactively and they graded and put rock down on the trail so that we could maintain pedestrian access. Again, looking at the beneficial use of those sites and ensuring that our public has access to the recreational features that have become part and parcel with our reclamation program. They do trash removal. This is just one, probably 2 months of trash that it was acquired on the Emma dump, and then on your right, bags of trash and suitcases and whatever from the Upper Silver Bow Creek corridor that was removed. These, simple tasks like removing garbage from sites are very important because they make sure that the infrastructure operates correctly. When you're receiving stormwater, you don't want anything in the way that's, going to cause something to go wrong. And then they come back and they pull out their handy iPad and they record all of the data. We are keeping track of, that they've sterified the ground and gotten it ready for seeding, but we're also keeping track of what quantities of dirt are being brought in and brought out, what sources of those dirt, what is the source of that dirt, and really trying to develop a very clear record of what we've got going on with our sites. The advantages of this is it's queryable. Rather than having a bunch of paper files that I have to go dig through and become frustrated by, I can query this and we can begin to sort of understand the comprehensive portrait of what not only the evaluations are telling us are happening on the sites, but the work that's being done to correct that. And it allows us to anticipate what our needs are going to be for the future and base all of our decisions on data. We can understand project durations and really plan for how our staff is going to be used over the course of a season. We have such a short construction window in Butte because of the weather that we really have to be effective in the 4 or 5 months that we have, no snow on the ground. It also has allowed us to really, it hasn't quite yet because it's so new, but what we'll be able to do is understand that the work that's being done on the hill is traceable to any impacts that we're seeing when it comes to Silver Bow Creek, because we really want to monitor what's going on and make sure that our program is efficient and effective at providing long-term protectiveness. Sort of moving beyond this very long-term management program is sort of the fun stuff, and this is the stuff that gets me really excited because it's not so work. It doesn't seem like work to me. But for example, the Foreman Park reclamation was such an awesome project for our community because it created this awesome benefit. And shortly thereafter, in 2012, my colleagues applied for a grant from the Butte Natural Resource Damage Program, and they had recommended or had proposed a cap enhancement program to install mature native trees in the reclaimed areas. And this was to enhance the caps and the reclamation that had been done there with a restoration initiative to provide tree canopy that would shade some of those areas that received a lot of sunlight, but also to provide additional root mass that would keep sediments in place. I think that this is a really cool thing because you grow up in Butte and you don't see very many trees, and then you come back and you're like, wow, there are trees all over the place. So it's kind of cool. But the integration of the tools, these digital tools, has allowed for an incredible amount of collaboration, and I think has exceeded the expectations of Butte Silver Bow when it comes to our ability to partner with other entities. We partner with Montana Tech to create planting areas for their program on our reclaimed areas. We monitor that. We work utilizing our spatial data through planning sessions all throughout the winter. We are able to invite non-Butte Silver Bow employees and different divisions of Montana Tech, for example, Clark Fork Watershed Education Program does the evaluations of our sites, but they work with the Native Plant Program to have consultancy on the plant selection or identifying areas where trees and plants could be planted in the future. And then their recommendations form what we do at Butte Silver Bow as far as environmental planning is concerned. One of the biggest assets we have, and one of the best accomplishments we've had in the last couple of years, is through this collaborative approach, we're beginning to have an ability to reconceive the seed mixes that we're using. So just like in the past, in the 1990s, when we were learning about reclamation at the beginning, we're utilizing best practice in science to reconceive the seed mixes that we use today so that we can, do a better job. And I've noticed that the new seed mix is far greener than the sort of beige hill that you see at the end of the year, and that's something that's really exciting to me. We're keeping track of all of this with our GIS system. These are stormwater channels that flow through the sites, and these are areas that become the areas where we'll plant trees, forbs, and grasses in the next corrective action season, which will begin next summer. But we're also utilizing best practice in decision making and program planning, which is something that's important to Butte Silver Bow. As we learn more, we are able to recalibrate and retool how we do things. So this is just another example of Butte Silver Bow and Montana Tech working together on these planting areas. We are going out into the field and we have mapped, this is a native plant dispersal area where Robert and his team have planted plants, but Butte Silver Bow placed plants in the vicinity as well, and we've mapped those. When we go back to evaluate that site, we're going to have a record not only of the remedial work that has been done in that area, but we'll have information on the restoration projects that have occurred in the area and how those restoration projects have become part of the remedial work that we have done. And I'm going to do some conclusions really quick before we do questions, because I think they're really important. It's really hard to think you're going to make a huge impact on land because you're a human and all you can do is plant something. But you're also doing this maintenance work within a regulatory regime, and it really challenges your idealism because making change within a regulatory regime is really difficult and it's hard. But if you take the long view, it's something that can seem and becomes much more plausible. That is something that I've learned about the approach of environmental planning that Butte Silver Bow has taken. As you can see in the pictures, there has been a very mega change in the appearance of what Butte used to look like and what it looks like today. That visual impact is one thing. It's making sure that it stays that way over the duration that is another thing. And that's where the importance of environmental planning comes into play and the importance of data and best practice. But you can't control nature. And we really need rain and we need precipitation. And those are things that are beyond the control of anyone in this room or outside of it. How can we better do our work so that we maintain water on site so that we don't see plants that are living through drought? And also keeping the cleanup in context when the before and after are so starkly different. I think about this a lot because when you grow up here and you remember Butte one way, I sometimes can't believe there was no grass when I was a child. Like, that's crazy. But as we move forward in this process and we see more collaboration and we see more relationships being built among stakeholders, we begin to understand the impact and the importance of our role in maintaining the integrity of these sites. So more collaboration and understanding is really the key to having stewardship over our land here. And I think for those of you in the room that are students, you're here learning about this tool that Butte Silver Bow is using, and you may go out in your careers and you may be doing this work somewhere else. But you have to kind of remember that you are the future leaders of how this is going to be done in other communities. And that's an incredibly powerful role to play. I think about that a lot because you are being charged with the stewardship of your place for a period of time, and what you do today is going to impact the tomorrow. And how can you make good decisions and do that job well, while also staying true to the regulatory regime that you have to operate within? And I think that that's something that will challenge you, and is probably a good perspective to keep. At least it's helped me to find purpose in every day that I spend working on these kinds of projects. And with that, you're all awake, so I will allow you to ask questions if you'd like to. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, most of this work is done on open areas, I think. Is there significant contamination under areas that have houses and sort of thing on it? Private property.
I'm not as closely related to the residential metals program or residential program. I can only speculate if it was a historic home and there was historic mine waste. But if you have questions specific to residential metals, I might not be the best person to answer that question.
Right. Well, I know they come in and they test soils from that and dig up the shards and bring it in. When I'm thinking about other more general contaminants, how much of that is in those systems, I guess.
And due to my lack of exposure to the residential programs, I wouldn't know. I can only speculate that the answer could be yes. But I would definitely direct you to the residential metals program. I have a contact here, Eric Hassler, if you'd like to talk to him, but otherwise I don't have data.
Because kind of building off that, when they identified the 178 sites, were there any that they maybe deemed or left out because they deemed inaccessible, like maybe they had a building or something on top of it that prevented any remediation or reclamation efforts from taking place?
I can only imagine. I mean, anecdotally, I was probably 6 in Walkerville when they came and tested our yard. We were part of that. I mean, if our yard had contamination, I'm sure underneath our house had contamination or underneath our garage. But within this program, that would have been very likely identified as a residential source, even if it was like a commercial use or a building, because it was a this particular program focuses on the non-residential. So it would be where a mine dump was located or where a mine was located, not necessarily a residence or private property.
How would you envision you in like 40 years? What would your ideas about that?
I think it would. I'd like to see it look a lot like Norm's Aspen Grove near the Stewart with the blanket flower, and like beautiful. I could see it looking beautiful. Or the way that the Big Butte looks when it blooms in the spring, when you see all of the wildflowers blossoming. I'd like to see more color when it's supposed to have color rather than just green. But I'd like it to look, well, I just like it to look beautiful. And I know that it has to be a little bit more balanced than that, but I'd like to see trees growing, and I'd like to see a canopy here that is enviable, because right now it's kind of like we're just beginning that process. So I think the efforts that we're making today are the things that I really want to see in 40 years when I'm ready.
Because that question was asked to me a couple of times too.
Really?
I'm curious what everybody think about it.
Yeah.
One answer to that was, when we started the native plant project, we had kind of control of a place that had not been polluted in mine. We looked at the species composition, and it went through a series of very beautiful flowers through the whole season.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of used that as a control, and that's what we were headed for when it was first licensed.
Yeah.
And I think you would have liked it.
Probably. I like pretty things. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Has the JS informed your weed management strategy at all?
Definitely. this year unlike any other. We've never tracked point-specific spatial data to where patches of weeds are occurring on these sites before. You know, the evaluators would draw an X, and it wouldn't be tremendously accurate, but now they're able to walk the full perimeter of where the major infestation is occurring. And then literally this year, I know CFWEP called our operations manager and said, we've got a problem, and he was able to go out and immediately have treatment done. But as we develop the work plans for these observations to be completed next spring, we will have maps to provide to our team in the weed department to go out and do that weed abatement utilizing point-specific data. Hopefully they'll have their own iPad system that we can then just load the data onto so that they can really see where they are. That's been a really huge advantage for this in particular, because weeds are such a pest on these sites because they don't see a lot of people, and there are areas where invasion is possible because of the lack of vegetation cover.
Yeah, this would actually be really important if you early detect plants. Like, I was out there this year with your people, and we detected a couple of leafy birch infestations, and I hope they're taken care of. But we still are good with taking care of weeds like leafy birch, because we are not as infested as towns west from us.
Right. Rick?
But I'm interested in your electronic field data collection. We looked at that in the hantavirus project. We're always afraid after we collected the data, the damn thing would go down, and we lose that day's data. But I thought this through, and the plant data, you go back and do it again, it doesn't run away. Do you ever have any failures?
We don't have failures. The iPad system that we've used has a cellular data plan, so we're not reliant upon Wi-Fi. So we are able to automatically upload all of that as you're entering. Yes. It's been really accurate. And then what we do at Butte Silver Bow is that data is downloaded from ArcGIS online, and it is QA/QC'd to make sure that it's cleaned up, that we don't have misspellings or poor metadata associated with it, and then we house that on our GIS server locally as well, which is a really important component of our data collection.
And then that server's backed up? Or?
Yes, it's backed up like daily, monthly, weekly. It's crazy amount of backups going on there. Yeah. But it's been a cool thing because I've been able to, you know, when we do trainings, for instance, and the agencies are in the room, I had them download the software onto their iPhones during the training period so that they could have the same tool that we were arming our evaluators with. And that replicability and the ability for everyone that's participating to have access to that, to see what we're doing, is something that I think is really important, because no one's working in a silo. They're all collaborating in this digital area.
And I think it would also be important to emphasize that that tool can be really just a perfect future tool for just having our planting sites planned together, and the sites that failed
Right.
this year can be targets for next planting season. So that's really a cool thing.
Yeah. The decision making is a little less where we think it would be good and much more targeted to where it's necessary too, which is something that allows for accuracy and really good decision making. I never thought I'd be so excited by GIS when I originally learned it, but I really think it's the coolest thing now. So.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.